All right. So we're in the fun part now. We've started looking at some of the different resurrection theories that are out there that actually try to compete with the Christian resurrection story. We looked at, if you'll recall, we looked at David Mearsh's idea that Jesus was drugged on the cross and that it was a conspiracy all along, and we went through that, and our final conclusion there was that he failed all of our categories as far as plausibility, explanatory power, and scope, and all these different things. Then we moved on to Michael Gorder's theory, and Dr. Gorder is an atheist. He was a Christian, was a priest at one time, converted to atheism. He still teaches, and so we went through and looked at his idea, and his theory of the resurrection is that, number one, that Peter hallucinated. You remember, he says that the transfiguration is proof that Peter was prone to hallucinations because he had done that before. He also refers to Peter's vision or hallucination in Acts chapter 10, where the sheet comes down with all the unclean animals on it and all of that. And so he says because of those two things, there's proof that Peter's prone to these type of hallucinations. And he said it was a lot like Susan Atkins' experience, the lady that was part of Charlie Manson's group, and that she had these visions of Jesus, and he said it was a lot like her experience. He calls upon communal hallucinations for the appearance to the 500, to all the disciples at one time. And he says that's much like the Mother Mary sightings that happen from time to time, and UFO sightings. He said that Paul had a secret, that he was really discontented with his Jewish faith and that he was angry against it. He said that Galatians 5 and Romans 8:15 both talk about Paul's animosity toward his Jewish faith, because he calls it a yoke, that the law is a yoke, and so that's proof that he has this animosity. Paul's also prone to hallucination, he says, because of 2 Corinthians 12:7, where he says he was carried up to the third heaven, and that's proof again that he hallucinates as well. He says the Christian resurrection story is all made up stuff. You remember we call that ad hoc, that it's just stuff that's just made up. And he says that the Christian resurrection story is full of ad hoc information. And so we wanted to go, and we started, and we said we're going to look at this a little bit closer and dig a little bit deeper into his theory and see what we can come up with before we go through the criteria and rank Dr. Gorder's theory here. But the first thing to notice is that, let me catch up. I do this all the time. I'm sorry.
On page 30?
We'll have to see. My pages are different. You told me to do that last week, and
31 is where that is.
Yeah. Start just right after 30, so it should be 31. So we said that Gorder's theory addresses all three of the bedrock facts. We have the three historical bedrock facts that all the scholars agree upon, whether they're atheist or Christian or whatever, and that is that Jesus died by crucifixion. And number two is that shortly after the crucifixion, several of his apostles had experiences that led them to believe that the risen Jesus had appeared to them. And then the third one is a few years later, Paul had an experience of the risen Jesus that led him to convert and for him to believe that Jesus had really appeared to him. And so Gorder addresses all three of these. He doesn't deny that Jesus died by crucifixion. He doesn't deny that Jesus, that the apostles and that Paul feel like and thought that Jesus really appeared to him. So that's good. He addresses those three bedrock facts that we have. But we want to take a closer look. And the closer look, he says that Peter hallucinated at the transfiguration. And so that's interesting. We say, okay, well, Peter possibly could have hallucinated. You know, hallucinations are real. We talked about them previously, and we'll continue to talk about them since they're a common topic among these naturalistic theories. So, you know, Peter could have hallucinated. We said that grief was a thing that really drove hallucinations, but this is before Jesus died. This is at the Transfiguration. But one thing that he doesn't account for is that all three people there would have had to have, you know, he wasn't by himself. He had John and James with him, and they would have had to have hallucinated the same thing as well. That takes us back to the communal hallucinations. And so that really is a tough thing to believe. And so we talked about hallucination facts, and this is important. We said that hallucinations are defined as false sensory perceptions. And so that something in our mind is making us hallucinate. And so we went through and we talked about the characteristics of hallucinations. We said that the multimodal hallucinations are extremely rare. That's where you see and hear, or you feel and taste, or touch, or some combination. Those are extremely rare. We said that they're a lot more common in women, and Mr. Sonny made a comment after that was quite amusing. So more common in women than men. They're more common in the elderly. We said that the most common trigger is grief. 50% of all hallucinations are triggered by grief. We also said that this doesn't include those that are mentally impaired or have mental illnesses, or people that are impaired by drug use, that are in some altered state because of drug use. So 50% of people that are not in that category, their hallucinations that they do have are triggered by grief. But here's the key point. Hallucinations are a mental event with no external trigger. There's nothing that brings them about. They're completely internal. That means they're generated from inside our own minds. It's not something that comes from the outside. It's generated from our own mind, from our own being, from our own perception of things. And so they cannot be shared because they're individualistic. That means you can't have a group hallucination. Dr. Lycona, I've told you before that this is his model that we're following here. He was fascinated with hallucinations, and he interviewed a bunch of Navy SEAL graduates. This class of graduates, I think there were 60-something of them in this one class of Navy SEALs, and that had gone through all of that, you know, and we've seen, you know, where they don't sleep for like 5 days and they're out on the beach lifting logs and all this stuff. And he said every single one of them said they had hallucinations during that period, brought on by all that stress and all that. Every single one of them had hallucinations. Now they're all in line. They're all together. They're all, you know, arms locked together. They're right there together. But not a single one of them had the same hallucination as anybody else. That's because they're not shared events. They're individualistic. And so that's very important to remember as we go through this. When we talk about communal hallucinations or these atheistic theories of the resurrection depend upon group hallucinations of any kind, they just don't happen. They can't happen. And so if we go through our ranking, remember we had our criteria that we looked at. That was how well does the theory come up as far as explanatory scope goes. You know, how well does he address that? How well does he address explanatory power? Does the theory have plausibility? How much ad hoc or made up stuff does it have? And how well does it illuminate, provide illumination for other knowledge of things? And so that's our criteria, and so we want to go through these. So explanatory scope, if I'll remind you, is looks at the quantity of the evidence that we have. And so if we read Golder's theory here, we look at the scope. And so the scope would be, does he address these three bedrock facts? How well does he address those? If his scope is not wide enough to address those in good detail, then he fails there. But he actually accounts for the bedrock facts. He gives a reason for each one of them. He doesn't deny that Jesus died by crucifixion, and then he gives a reason why the apostles may have seen Jesus, and he gives a reason why Paul may have seen Jesus. And so he addresses all of those. And so for explanatory scope, his theory passes in that category. And the next category is explanatory power. And that's the quality of the facts. So these facts that he's presenting to support his theory, how solid are those facts that he presents? How solid are they? How much power do they have? And so we'll go through and we'll look at some of these. Again, he appeals to group hallucinations. So that doesn't have a lot of explanatory power because we said that those can't be, you can't experience a group hallucination. That also doesn't account for the appearance to the apostles, to the 11, to the 500. He can't address that unless he appeals to group hallucinations, which can't help. And so he doesn't have a lot of explanatory power to explain that other than to just blank say it's group hallucinations. And so Goulder's theory fails as far as explanatory power goes. It doesn't have enough power to explain these phenomena as we would like. The next category is plausibility. One of the things that's implausible is he renews an old argument. And we talked about that. He renews this old, long-settled argument that Paul was actually preaching a non-bodily resurrection. That was a big debate years and years and years and years ago about, is Paul actually preaching and teaching about a spiritual resurrection only, or is he preaching about a bodily resurrection? And they went back and forth over this. And this debate was settled long ago that Paul is talking about a bodily resurrection at the end of time, and that Jesus' resurrection was a bodily resurrection. But he brings this old argument back up to use this as part of his evidence to explain what Paul is that Paul is hallucinating, that Paul's story is not credible. But if he does that, he's going directly against 1 Corinthians 15, 3 through 8. You remember we said that is that oral tradition that's embedded within that scripture that goes back to right after the resurrection. It's part of that oral kerygma that started right with the Jerusalem apostles, and it started right after the resurrection. Goulder has to deny what that early kerygma says, what that early creed says, to hold on to the fact that he's teaching that Peter and Paul were teaching two different types of resurrection. 1 Corinthians 15:3 says that I delivered unto you as of first importance what I also received. And it's thought that he received that when he went to Jerusalem, of course. He spent 15 days. Peter and Paul were together there for 15 days, and their preaching was aligned. They were preaching the same thing. One wasn't preaching a spiritual resurrection and the other a bodily resurrection. They were preaching the same thing. And so this doesn't play into the plausibility of Goulder's theory. So he disputes Paul. He relies on communal hallucinations. Again, that's not plausible. And we've seen the reasons why that's not plausible. And so Goulder fails on plausibility. And the next category is the ad hoc, or how much made up stuff does he have to provide to fill in the gaps to make his story work. And there's a lot in his theory that he has to make up, or the conjecture that he has to put forward to fill in these gaps. And that's back to the communal hallucinations again. And so those things he just makes up and pulls out of thin air, bringing up the old argument again between bodily resurrection and a spiritual resurrection. He said the communal hallucinations, Paul doubting his Jewish faith and being in, in hatred toward his Jewish faith, and that was why he was, trying to compensate for that. And so as far as plausibility goes, Goulder's theory fails in plausibility as well. Illumination is that category to where if this theory is true, can it illuminate other things that we look at? Can it illuminate things that we study about our Christian faith? If Goulder's theory is true, it'd provide a lot of information. It would tell us that communal hallucinations are true. It would tell us a lot of different things. So as far as illumination goes, Goulder's theory passes because it would give us a lot of information if it were true. Of course it's not. So if we look at the scorecard, this is how Goulder's scorecard comes up. He passes for explanatory scope. He fails under explanatory power. He fails under plausibility. He has a lot of ad hoc material, but he passes under illumination. And so that's where Goulder stands. But we want to move on to the next one, and the next one is by a man named Gerd Ludemann. You notice these are all Germans? Like Nietzsche and Marx and, those people. I'm sorry, there's some good Germans. They gave us some good theology too, so I just think it's interesting. So our next resurrection theory comes from Gerd Ludemann, and he's another one of these New Testament scholars that left Christianity for atheism. And he's really become entrenched in atheism now, and he's really open about it. He's real straightforward. He says, my goal is not just to deny Christianity, but it's to teach everybody else that it's false. So he's actively working against Christianity to discourage people from Christianity and to encourage them to leave. And so that gives us a lot of insight. Ludemann's he's not trying to hide the fact that he's got this huge bias against Christianity, and his goal is not to bring the truth or not to bring new information. His goal specifically is to take you away from your Christianity. So here's the bad thing. Ludemann is like Goulder. He's teaching in a university. He's a university professor at the University of Göttingen in Germany. He started publishing some works that brought Christianity into question, and he got further and further and further away from that. But here's the really sad thing. Rather than dismissing him from the university, they simply changed his title. So they changed his title from Chair of New Testament Studies to Chair of History and Literature of Early Christianity. So he's still teaching. He's still there. And as we said with Goulder, all of these German parents that have raised their children up in the church and they send them off to study history and literature of early Christianity, this is the guy they end up in his class. These theories sound funny until we start thinking about that. And these theories plant the seed in a lot of our young people's minds. Anyway, so we'll go through his theory. Peter hallucinated. That sound familiar? One of the leading atheists in the 21st century is a man named Bart Ehrman. And Bart Ehrman said, either Jesus really appeared to his disciples after the crucifixion, or they were seeing things. That's the only two options. And so when you start looking through these resurrection theories, either Jesus appeared or they were seeing things. That's your only choices. So any of these theories that don't agree with the Christian resurrection theory, they have to rely upon some type of altered state of consciousness or some type of hallucination if they're going to satisfy and answer the three bedrock facts. And so we'll see this about hallucinations over and again. But Ludemann has nuanced his hallucination theory, and he's put a few little changes in it and tweaked it a little bit so that it's different in some ways, and we'll look at that. One of the ways is that he said that the apostles hallucinated this because they were members of the lower part of the intellectual culture. That's his words. That they're the lower part of the intellectual culture, so naturally they hallucinated. And so that gives you some idea what his bias is and where he's at. The interesting thing is that Paul, who contributed more to the New Testament than any other writer, was highly educated. It's been said that he held the equivalent of 2 PhDs in today's terms, in theology and religion. And so he was by no means an idiot. Luke was a highly trained physician. So he was by no means at the lower end of the intellectual culture. Whoever wrote the book of Hebrews, I told you how much I love Hebrews. Whoever wrote that certainly wasn't a lower level. They were very, very well educated in the Greek literature. But he says that Peter's reaction, Peter hallucinated in a one-on-one setting, and then that stimulated others to hallucinate as well. And he calls it this mass ecstasy, that it just whips everybody up into a frenzy. And it's like with the, when at the 500, that they see one person just get really excited, and then it encourages everybody else to do that. And so that's his reason that they hallucinated in a group. It wasn't a direct communal hallucination, but that Peter stimulated them into that hallucination. So that's the little tweak that Ludemann adds to it. He says that it was widespread, and that this hallucination spread to Jesus' brother James. And that James was part of this mass ecstasy, and that was part of the reason that he converted. He too says that Paul had doubts. That Paul had doubts about his Jewish faith, and so that led him to actually go after Christians. He was trying to compensate. And so that's what he's really relying upon. Ludemann, without using the words, is compensational psychology. It's a field of psychology where a person overcompensates for what they feel to be a weakness. And so that's his theory, is that Paul was feeling weak about his Jewish faith, and that he was trying to overcompensate, and so he was really bearing down on the Christians and persecuting them. It's interesting to me that these guys like Ludemann are trying to psychoanalyze someone that lived 2,000 years ago on a very limited amount of information, that lived in a different culture, and they're not even psychoanalysts. He's a New Testament scholar. What's he doing trying to psychoanalyze anybody? And so that becomes more, and we'll get into that in a little bit, but that becomes more of a red flag, that he's relying upon his own psychoanalysis of someone. Beyond that, how does he explain that if that's the case, then Paul would have to been compensating when he converted to Christianity as well? You see, Paul was zealous for his Jewish faith, and then he was zealous for Christianity. And so was he displeased with Christianity after he made the move? That becomes highly unlikely. And so if he's compensating, Ludemann can't have it both ways. Either he was compensating for one or the other, but he can't compensate for both. And so that becomes another problem. That's not likely the case. And then this is real easy. You just say the Gospels are a fabrication. And so that throws everybody off, right? So that's part of your defense, that the Gospels are a fabrication. Another thing is that Christ hadn't returned yet. He was supposed to come back pretty soon. He hadn't come back yet. This is all a fabrication. This is all a false story. And so he's trying to undermine Christianity. As I said, this is more of an anti-theory than it is a theory. It's an anti-Christian resurrection story. But if we begin to look at the explanatory scope, he accounts for all three of the bedrock facts. He doesn't dispute that Jesus died by crucifixion. He agrees that the apostles and Paul saw things that led them to believe that Jesus had really appeared to them. And so he compensates for those. He has different stories or different reasons for why that phenomenon happened, but he accounts for those just like Goulder did, and so he gets a passing score for that. As far as explanatory power goes, he doesn't have a lot of explanatory power. He speculates regarding Paul. We said that he's playing the role of a psychoanalyst without the training or the know-how, and so that's a problem that he has. That lacks explanatory power. He says that Paul had a Gentile friend that was actually a Christian, and over the years, this Christian friend of his drew him away from his Jewish faith and drew him toward Christianity, and that's why he converted. He didn't really see a risen Jesus. He converted because this childhood friend had worked on him all these years, and that encouraged him to convert. Again, that lacks explanatory power. Paul doubting his Jewish faith, as we said. He speculates, the childhood friend, he speculates about Peter as well. And he speculates about the 500. And so he's full of these speculations, and he doesn't have a lot of good solid evidence to back it up. And so as far as his explanatory power goes, he fails in that category as well. And if we look at plausibility, this is basically an overlap of the same type of situations. It's not very plausible that he relies on these group hallucinations that keep coming up. Remember, that was why we said at the beginning this morning about hallucinations can't be shared. They're an individual event. They're an individual phenomenon. And it's really important to keep that in mind, because all these guys rely upon a group hallucination type scenario to explain two of the three bedrock facts. And so the plausibility suffers because of that. Psychological conjecture, again, it's not plausible for a Bible scholar to do deep psychoanalysis of people that lived 2,000 years ago on very little evidence without being able to sit down and interview them and talk to them. I'm sure there's some of you in here that have experience with that. If you try to psychoanalyze a long dead person, that's not going to be very good. They can't speak for themselves anymore. That's not very plausible. This mass ecstasy at Pentecost, he says that Pentecost was just a part of this same thing that Peter went through. Said at Pentecost that a couple of the apostles got worked up, and they had these visions and were whipped into this mass ecstasy, and it carried over into the crowd, and that it whipped up all these people that ended up with 3,000 people being baptized. And he says that's more proof. That's not very plausible either. James has traveled to Jerusalem. He said that James was trying to get to Jerusalem so that he could get in on this mass ecstasy, that he wanted to get in and be a part of it. And so he rushed to Jerusalem to be a part of that. That's not very plausible either. It's more plausible that he came a little bit later, and that he came just to see what was happening, rather than he came rushing to, on rumors that there was this mass ecstasy going on. It's like Woodstock, and he wanted to get there to see what Woodstock was all about. It wasn't like that, so that's not very plausible as well. Ludeman's theory lacks plausibility in many, many areas. Less ad hoc. This is the made up stuff, and it's not less ad hoc. Ludeman's theory is actually more ad hoc. And again, it's the same categories. He makes up the story about the group hallucinations. He has to, for that to work. He makes up Paul's psychology. You know, that's something that's just made up. Where does that come from? There's no evidence, there's no documents, there's no facts around Paul having this type of psychology, so that's all ad hoc, made up stuff. Ludeman's theory is loaded with ad hoc assumptions. Under illumination, Ludeman passes illumination again because if his theory is correct, it could tell us a lot about a lot of different things. And so he passes that category. And so Ludeman looks a lot like Goulder. He passes on explanatory scope. He fails on explanatory power, fails on plausibility, fails on ad hoc, and he passes on illumination. And so you can see that everyone relies to some degree upon these hallucination theories. That's the most popular. Gary Habermas, one of the top resurrection scholars today, has said that that's the most common resurrection theory over the last 100 years is hallucinations. There again, there's only two possibilities when you come down and you start thinking about it. How do you account for the apostles saying, we saw Jesus? Either they really saw him or they were hallucinating. And so that becomes really, starts condensing down your options. If you come up with some theory aside from the Christian resurrection story, it has to be some type of hallucination story. But I want to go ahead and move in. We've got just about 5 minutes, but I want us to go ahead and move to the Christian resurrection story. And so this is what we've all been waiting for, right? I love that picture. Isn't that neat? I guess you can tell I like pictures and art. So, one of the first things that we realize about the Christian resurrection story is that at its core, it's very different from all these theories that we've looked at. And I need to mention there's about three or four more theories that we're not going to cover in class because they're redundant to some extent. There's some variation in the other three or four, but for the most part, they all rely upon some type of altered state of consciousness or some type of hallucination theory. So I won't bore you with going through three or four more. But in all, there's about 6 theories that are out there now that are actively being debated about the resurrection and that are naturalistic. And then, of course, there's the resurrection story, the resurrection narrative. But we won't go through any more of those, but just suffice to say that they're all basically like what we just looked at with Goulder and Ludeman. So if we look at the Christian resurrection story, it's different in a lot of different ways. One of the biggest ways it differs is that it doesn't take long before it calls upon you to believe in a supernatural causal agent. You know, we know that dead people stay dead usually, right?
What do these people that you've talked about, what do they believe about the Old Testament? Because the Old Testament points to Jesus in multiple scriptures, all the way through.
Right.
They speak of the resurrection. They speak of all these different things. Do they just discount the Old Testament as just...
Yeah, completely, because they're atheist. They started out as Christians and now they're atheist. And, you know, the definition of atheism is they do not believe in God, much less Jesus and Christianity. So, you know, for them, the answer is God does not exist. And so you back up from that and to hold true to that statement, God does not exist, they have to not believe in the resurrection. And so Old Testament goes away too.
Of course, I'm sure you're just bringing up certain points that they've talked about.
Yeah,
you know, concerning
sure.
The resurrection.
Yeah.
And there are other things that they discount as well, but I just can't understand how someone could read the Old Testament and then not see that there is a Jesus. And of course, I guess the Jews believed we're still waiting on Jesus.
Yeah.
So there's,
Well, they started the resurrection. If you started there and you just multiple regression, you go back. If you don't believe in the resurrection, then you can just by multiple regression go back and not believe in God either. And so, once you give up on, you don't have very many choices. Once you give up on the resurrection of Jesus, you either become Jewish and you're still waiting on Christ, or you become atheist. That's your only two options, really. Well, I guess you can become agnostic, but you have any thought on that, Biff?
Same difference.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's a lazy atheist is what it is. But
I can see where they could use an argument where Paul would be at odds with the Jewish faith based on what we know today, I guess. I could see where they could think that. But
right.
At that time, where some had dug themselves in and some were not understanding.
Yeah.
And once they understood.
Right.
That this all is the same.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, but like I say, if you deny the Old Testament, then your cohesive story that you're trying to, and that's the way we view it. It's a cohesive story that there's just a 400-year gap between part 1 and part 2, right? But it's the same story and it's a continuous story, and we read it. The Old Testament foretells of the new and of the coming of Christ and the resurrection and all of that. But like I said, if you're an atheist and you're a Christian scholar, and then you say, no, now I'm an atheist, I don't believe in the resurrection, I don't believe in God either. They just go back up the line. So they don't go from Christianity back to their Jewish faith back to Judaism, but so that's their cutoff. They don't believe in a supernatural power, I guess you could say, or a causal agent, and that's where we get into this difficulty. Difficulty when we get to the Christian resurrection story. You immediately say, who raised Jesus from the dead? But remember, we're looking at this from a historical standpoint, so we still have to hold off on that judgment. We said in the beginning, as historians, we can say whether Jesus rose from the dead or not based upon the facts, but we can't say who raised him. That's not within the scope of a historian. That's not within their domain. A historian can't say something did or did not happen in the supernatural. And so if we keep that in our mind, that's within the domain of a historian, can only go so far. There's a point to where we have to make this transition where we take the historian hat off and put the logical hat back on, and we step over here and we say, God raised Jesus from the dead. And so we have to do that, but we can't do that yet, and we can't do that with the Michael of the world yet. We're still on a historical footing. We're still trying to hold on to this common ground, and both of us stand on the same common ground and make the same argument from history. So,
you and I, and maybe another group of people, we could perform an act based on history that someone said, well, this is going to happen, that's going to happen. But how could we pull other people into our act, such as the Roman guards, the different trials how could we pull all these multitude of people into an act that had no idea what the act was about? How do you have a Roman guard that doesn't know anything about Jesus decide, he's going to pierce him in the side?
Yeah.
How do you get people to do things that?
Well, like I say, we've just touched different, we've just scratching the surface along here. But the first thing that you're doing naturally is you're assuming that Scripture's right. You're assuming that the gospel stories are right. Michael doesn't believe in the Bible. He doesn't believe in the Gospels. And so at some point along the way, and we'll touch on it when we get to the last 2 weeks of this, but at some point you have to argue for the validity, the authority, the inspiration, the inerrancy and sufficiency of Scripture. And you have to do that. You have to move them to a belief in the Gospels, because the Gospels become what you're arguing from. And so that's what makes it tricky. We're kind of skating on ice here because, as Christians, because Michael still won't let us use the Bible. You know, we can possibly, but the hardcore Michael, we hadn't got to the point yet. We're getting there quick, but we haven't got to the point yet to where Michael could go, oh man, yeah, the Bible is God's Word.
I
So
wasn't necessarily speaking in that sense. I was speaking in the sense that these people are professors that supposedly know the Bible.
right,
That supposedly know that that is their job.
right.
How can they take history of the Bible that they're supposed to be teaching that point to Jesus and turn it completely around?
Well, we'll see this as we'll see a lot of this as we get into the Christian, because the Christian resurrection story. I'm not going to sit here and tell you about our resurrection. Everybody knows our resurrection story. You know, you should read it in the Bible if you want to know what it is. But we all know about that. So the presentation that we give is counter arguing what the atheist says. And so as we counter argue that, one of the big topics is that the Gospels are deceptive, and that the sources are deficient. And so we have to address deficient sources. That's one of their arguments. The Gospels are deficient. So hang on 1 minute. Kelly, I'm sorry.
Aren't there, this may be a little off topic what y'all were talking about, but aren't there, like, outside references to, like, where they sent the guard to the tomb and those types of things that were from non-biblical sources?
Not about the guards around the tomb. That's one thing that we were talking about last week, is we wish we had some of those authentic government documents. We've got some pseudo autographical documents, but they're not accurate, and we can't attribute those to who they say wrote them. But we don't have anything around that. We've got the accounts in the Gospels, and so you have to go to the Gospels and say these are true, authentic documents. And then, like I said, we eventually get into inspiration that those documents are actually God's Word. So we'll tie all that together eventually. But yeah, that's what I said, this is what we wish we had. That's one of the things that we wish we had. We wish we had some things like that. But
there are certain things, though, that the Bible said that science said was not true, like the world is flat.
sure.
And certain things such as that
Sure.
the Bible said, and then science eventually proved what the Bible said.
Right. And the atheist says, yeah, and I can go watch Harry Potter, and there's things in Harry Potter that are true too. You know, that's what they say. So it's a arguing with them gets tough. No.
Understand how someone could be a professor teaching.
So let me tell you one quick story. We'll adjourn. This guy right here, this most popular atheist in the country, and I'll bring this up again because it's later in here. Same story. He goes to college, studies Bible in college. He goes to works on his master's. He goes to Princeton Theological Seminary, working on his doctorate. About 3/4 of the way through his doctorate, this guy is on his way to being a great scholar. He's a textual critic, is what he specializes in. That's what he's on his way to being a great scholar. He turns a paper in, and the professor writes on the corner of it, "Maybe Mark got it wrong." Maybe Mark got it wrong. And he says he got that paper back, and he started thinking about that, and he let that eat on him. And that one comment shifted his whole perspective. So he finishes his doctorate. He's the New Testament textual critic, and he's done some good work in textual criticism for Christianity, but he's made a living out of tearing down and arguing against the Christian resurrection, against Jesus. He's jazzed it up, and he's souped up his stories. He's written a lot of books that are #1 sellers, New York Times bestsellers, believe it or not, because he takes a fact and he stretches it way, way out there. We'll look at one in particular that he's stretched way out there. And he doesn't necessarily lie, but he intentionally leads you in a direction that's false. And all that started, his whole turn started from a professor writing, "Maybe Mark got it wrong." So, there was something wrong with his faith to begin with, right? I mean, if you can't take that kind of criticism, if that just makes him bail out, I mean, I've had professors butcher me before, repeatedly. You know, so,
A lot of people that started out right and greed got.
yeah, yeah.
So.
Yeah, you greed or pride or something. Yeah, pride, exactly.